The graveyard shift at St. Jude's at 3 a.m. wasn't a void. It was a pressurized weight of industrial bleach and the copper tang of dried blood. I stood by the supply cart in Trauma Bay 1, the floor buffer's rhythmic hum vibrating through my low-status nursing clogs like a distant, mechanical heartbeat. Then, the hook snagged. Against my hip, the old Motorola pager, a brick of analog antiquity from my days with the 24th, shuddered with a sudden, gritty violence. 3 short bursts. 1 long. It was the Angel PJ, contact code, a ghost signal from a life I'd buried under layers of nursing certifications. My pulse remained steady, anchored by my grey eyes fixed on the monitor. I chose not to let it spike. Instead, I monitored the shallow rise of Mrs. Griffin's, Gable's chest in bed 4, the hospital's air vents hissing like a cornered snake to mask the secret rhythm on my hip. In this sterile graveyard, I was a nobody, a burnout hire on the edge of the city. Yet, that vibration was a physical tether back to the noise. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, the phantom roar of a pavehawk rotor spinning in the back of my skull as I initiated tactical breathing. The stillness shattered as the double doors of the bay swung open with a violent gust of recycled air. Dr. Maximus Vanderbilt marched in, his white coat crisp enough to cut glass, trailing a scent of expensive sandalwood and unearned confidence. Nurse Sloane followed a half-step behind, her tablet glowing with the latest patient metrics like a digital torch. Vanderbilt didn't look at the patients. He looked at the optics of the room. He crossed to the workstation and swept a metal IV tray off the edge with a casual flick of his hip. The clang was a sharp, metallic ring, a bright, dissonant sound that made the young residents at the station flinch. I didn't flinch. I kept my eyes on Mrs. Gable's vitals, noticing the slight, erratic flutter in her blood pressure that Vanderbilt's tunnel vision ignored. Vance! His voice was a sharp, tactical bark designed for an audience. Vance, cart in the lane. Again, I don't fund bottlenecks. I fund surgical flow. Move it before the metrics drop. He was 45, same as me, but he lived in a world of Instagram success rates, while I lived in the scars hidden under my blue scrubs. Vanderbilt stepped into my personal space, weaponizing his height. The smell of bleach felt thin against the oppressive cloud of his cologne. I looked at your file again. Avery. A residency at 45. Pathetic. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that still reached every ear in the bay. You're a technical error, Avery. A mute outlier in a system built for precision. St. Jude's is an elite ecosystem. We don't have room for night. Shift salvage. Sloane let out a sharp, sycophantic titter. I felt the heat rising in my neck, the old Valkyrie instinct to reach for a sidearm that wasn't there. I didn't move. I initiated tactical breathing. Inhale 4. Hold 4. Exhale 4. Hold 4. The world shrank to the rhythm of the numbers. The humiliation was just noise, a tactical distraction to be ignored. My knuckles whitened against the metal cart, but my hands remained steady. I watched Vanderbilt's mouth move, his ego, a tactical vulnerability he wasn't even aware of. He wanted a reaction. I gave him a stone wall. He thought he was breaking a burnout. Unaware, he was shouting at a ghost who had held men's intestines inside their bodies while being shot at. I looked past his shoulder, noticing Mrs. Pride, Gable's neck beginning to flush. A faint, angry red blooming under her chin. "Mrs. Gable is having an anaphylactic reaction to the contrast dye," I said, my voice a raspy gravel dragging through a rock quarry. Vanderbilt didn't even turn around. He just scoffed, adjusting his silk tie in the reflection of the glass cabinets. "Diagnosing isn't in your pay grade. Vance. Stop LAR-ping as a physician and focus on the sanitation. It's the only value you provide." He began to turn away, his mind already on his next social media post. Then, the overhead PA system crackled to life. The sound of a relay snapping, cutting through the air like a guillotine. The tone was sharp, high-pitched, and unrelenting. Code Black. Mass casualty incident. Level 1 activation. All surgical staff to Trauma Bay 1. This is not a drill. The lights flickered once. Red emergency lamps stuttering to life as the floor began to vibrate with the approach of heavy vehicles. Vanderbilt's face went from flush to a sickly, translucent grey in 3 seconds. The pager on my hip vibrated again. The noise was coming, and I was the only one who knew how to breathe in it. The code black alarm was a jagged percussion tearing through the sterile pretense of St. Emma. Jude's. Outside, the heavy thumping of pavehawk rotors began to shake the roof. A sound, triggering a neural shock in my marrow. My hands didn't shake. They remembered the weight of the air. It was the medical mosh pit starting up. A symphony of screeching gurney wheels and shouted orders. I stepped away from the cart, leaving Mrs. Gable to the frantic swarm of nurses who finally noticed her hives. Trauma Bay 1 was no longer a graveyard. It was a kill zone. Vanderbilt stood in the center, his expensive sandalwood scent replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of cold sweat and iodine. He looked at the triage board, then at the doors, then back at the board. His hands were tucked into his pockets to hide the tremor. Decision paralysis. I'd seen it in green lieutenants in the Hindu Kush. The moment the plan evaporates and the ego realizes it can't breathe under the pressure. He wasn't a surgeon anymore. He was a deer in the high beams of a coming storm. The chaos accelerated as carts slammed into the bay. Paramedics shouting vitals over the din. Janitor. Move. Greg, a medtech who shared Vanderbilt's contempt, hissed as he shoved a crash cart past me. I didn't respond. I didn't have time for the hierarchy. I performed a visual triage as the first wave hit. A chest wound, a traumatic amputation, a crushing head injury. I saw who lived and who died before the first stethoscope touched a chest. My mind mapped the room. O2 tank locations. The bottleneck at the supply closet. The conductive fluid near bed 2. Vanderbilt was still staring at a clipboard. His mouth hanging open as a resident asked for a secondary line. He was drowning in the optics of the disaster, worried about the failure rate before the patients even arrived. I moved through the frenzy like a shadow, my breathing, a steady 4-4-4-4 rhythm, keeping the world from blurring. I was a ghost in blue scrubs, invisible because Vanderbilt and his ilk couldn't imagine competence wearing a mop bucket smile. I reached the surgical storage locker and didn't wait for a code. I knew the override from watching the tech last week. My hands were steady as I prepped the vascular kit, my fingers moving by muscle memory to select the hemostats and the large-bore cannulas. I did it blind, my eyes scanning the room for the real threat. The contrast was stark. Vanderbilt was shouting at a nurse about a misplaced tablet, while I was prepping for a femoral repair that hadn't even been called for yet. The air in the bay grew heavy, with the smell of ozone and wet asphalt. I could feel the tension spiking, the noise I craved finally drowning out the ringing in my ears. The tremor in my fingers, the one Vanderbilt thought was alcoholism, vanished the moment I touched the cold steel of the instruments. I wasn't the burnout nurse anymore. I was the angel of the 24th, and the St. Jude's hierarchy was about to collide with a reality that didn't care about Ivy League diplomas. The double doors burst open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. A stretcher flew through, pushed by 2 SEALs in tattered BDUs, their faces smeared with grease and blood. Leading them was a man I recognized, Dutch. 6'5" of scarred neck armor and raw aggression. He didn't wait for the triage nurse. He grabbed Vanderbilt by the lapels of his pristine white coat and slammed him against the workstation, scattering glass vials across the floor. He's a commander. Cassian Reed. BP 60, over 40, and dropping. Dutch growled, his voice a low-frequency threat that silenced the room. Lose him? And there isn't a hole deep enough in this city to hide you from us. Vanderbilt's decision paralysis turned into pure terror. He looked at the patient. Reed was Bale. His chest, a mess of shrapnel and dark, welling blood. And then, at the SEAL's fist. Reed's monitor let out a long, flatline scream. The room went cold. Vanderbilt looked like he was going to vomit. I didn't wait for the order. I stepped into the sterile field, my eyes locking onto the dark stain blooming in the commander's groin. The monitor's flatline scream was a high-frequency blade cutting through the frantic noise of Trauma Bay 1. Commander Cassian Reed lay on the table, his skin the color of wet sidewalk, the dark stain under his groin expanding with every useless compression. Dr. Maximus Vanderbilt was a man possessed by his own tunnel vision. He hovered over the commander's chest, his hands fumbling with a thoracotomy kit, his eyes fixed on the shrapnel wounds near the heart. He didn't see the junctional bleed. He didn't see the life literally pouring out of the patient's femoral artery onto the floor. I stood at the foot of the bed, my analytic overlay mapping the foreign object damage in Vanderbilt's approach. He was treating the optics while ignoring the silent killer in the groin. The smell of iron was so thick I could taste it, a hot vapor reminding me of the belly of a Chinook. I felt the vibration of the rotors on the roof again, a ghost pulse demanding action. Vanderbilt barked at Sloane for more suction, his voice cracking under the weight of Dutch's threat. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't wait for a status update. I stepped forward, my scrubs brushing against Greg. The resident, who was mid-compression. I shoved him aside with a shoulder check that sent him stumbling into the crash cart. The bay went silent for a heartbeat. The only sound, the high-pitched whine of the defibrillator charging to 360 joules. Vanderbilt looked up, his face twisted in a mask of panic. Vance, what the hell are you doing? Get back to... I ignored him. I drove my right fist into the commander's groin, with the full weight of my body behind it. It wasn't a medical gesture. It was a kinetic thrust, a raw application of physics. I felt the pelvic bone through the layers of muscle and the slick, hot resistance of the femoral artery. The heat of the blood was a shock, soaking through my glove and up my wrist in a heartbeat. I could feel the thready pulse under my knuckles. I wasn't just a nurse anymore. I was the anchor. Stop compression, I said, the words a raspy, low-frequency command that seemed to vibrate the very air. Vanderbilt froze, his hand hovering over the thoracotomy tray. "You're pumping the blood out of him." My fist was a plug in a dam, the rigid resistance of the bone providing the anvil for my knuckles. The crackle of bone-on-fist pressure sent a dull ache up my arm, but it was a grounding pain, a reminder that I was still real. The monitor's screams stuttered, then changed. The flat line broke into a jagged, uneven sinus rhythm. A collective intake of breath echoed through the trauma bay. Vanderbilt's mouth opened and closed, his armor shattered by a move he hadn't seen since a textbook in the 90s. He looked at my fist, then at the monitor, then at the dark, warm paddle on the floor. He was a man who had lost his audience. The janitor had just held the line while the surgeon had been busy failing. Reed's blood pressure ticked up 65, 70, 72. The room remained in a state of shock. The chaotic mosh pit, frozen by the raw competence of a woman they had spent the night crushing. Vanderbilt's face was a hollow mask of humiliation. His sandalwood scent entirely vanished. He looked at me, not with gratitude, but with the cold, calculating fury of a man whose status had been compromised. Then, the double doors swung open again. Marcus Quinlan, the hospital administrator, stepped in. His expensive suit, a sharp contrast to the blood-slicked floor. He held a tablet like a weapon, his eyes scanning the carnage until they landed on me. He didn't look at the stabilized commander. He looked at the assault on his staff. "Avery Vance," he said, his voice a smooth, corporate hiss. "Hands off. Vance. You just committed a career suicide. You're suspended for gross malpractice and battery. Security will handle the optics from here." I didn't let go of the artery. I just looked him in the eye and kept the legal hold on Reed's life. The cardboard box in my arms felt heavier than a rucksack. It contained the fragments of a life I'd tried to build in the shadows. A worn stethoscope, a few clinical manuals, and a framed photo of a unit I could no longer name. I walked through the quiet hallways of Ward 4 West, the silence of the hospital, now a mocking thing. Marcus Quinlan walked beside me, his smug silence a physical pressure. He kept his target fixation on the paperwork in his hand, a corporate death warrant for my nursing career. To him, the crimp wasn't a life saved. It was a liability, a breach of the optics he spent his days polishing. I caught a glimpse of myself in the glass of the cafeteria doors, a 45-year-old woman in blue scrubs, being escorted out like a common thief. I didn't say a word. I didn't explain the medical necessity. I just followed my own private rule. Leave with dignity. The scent of industrial bleach followed me, a reminder of the janitor Vanderbilt thought I was. We reached the main lobby. The space was a vast, cold expanse of polished marble and glass, the early morning light beginning to bleed through the skylights. Up on the second-floor balcony, Dr. Maximus Vanderbilt stood with his hands in his pockets, watching my walk of shame with a thin, satisfied smile. He thought he'd won. He thought the hierarchy had successfully purged the anomaly. Quinlan stopped at the security desk and made a theatrical show of signing my exit papers. "Say it. Jude's isn't a frontier. Avery," he said, not even looking up. "We don't tolerate rogue variables. You're not being fired. You're being erased. Consider the lack of handcuffs a professional courtesy." I didn't respond. I just adjusted the weight of the box and turned toward the exit, Then, the double doors of the patient elevator behind us hissed open. The atmosphere in the lobby shifted instantly. The oppressive quiet was shattered by a sound I knew better than my own heartbeat. The resonant, synchronized stomp of military boots on marble. Commander Cassian Reed stepped out of the elevator, supported by 2 of his men but standing on his own power. His face was still pale, but his eyes were sharp, focused. He looked across the lobby, ignoring the nurses and the residents, until his gaze landed on me. I saw the flash of recognition in his eyes, the memory of the angel call sign from a dozen extraction points. Marcus Quinlan began to speak, his voice a nervous, high-pitched chatter. "Commander, your recovery protocol requires stabilization. This exit is strictly non-compliant." Reed didn't even acknowledge his existence. He took a single, steady step forward. Behind him, Dutch and the rest of the SEAL team, men who looked like they had been forged in the same fire I had snapped to attention. It was a thunderous, collective movement that seemed to rattle the glass in the ceiling. Vanderbilt's smile vanished from the balcony. Quinlan's mouth hung open, his target fixation finally broken by a social status flip he couldn't comprehend. "Angel," Reed said, his voice a raspy gravel that echoed through the vast lobby. Then he raised his hand to his brow. The SEAL team followed suit in perfect, deadly unison. It was the Special Ops salute, a snap of military precision that acknowledged my true rank in a way no hospital credential ever could. The silence that followed was absolute, a dead-air moment that stripped Vanderbilt and Quinlan of their authority in front of the entire morning shift. For a heartbeat, the hospital wasn't a hierarchy. It was a battlefield, and I was the one they were honoring. Then, the lights flickered. A low, guttural groan vibrated through the floor, the sound of the main power grid dying. The red emergency lamps stuttered to life, casting the lobby in a bloody, ominous glow. From outside, the heavy, rhythmic thumping of Blackwell helicopters began to rumble. The siege atmosphere had arrived. I dropped the box. My hands stopped shaking. I was back in the noise. The blackout didn't just take the light. It took the hospital's soul. When the main breakers tripped, the massive HVAC system died with a guttural, mechanical groan, causing an abrupt drop in air pressure that made my eardrums pop painfully. The sudden silence that followed was thick and unnatural, a pressurized vacuum replaced by the tactile grit of drywall dust shaken loose from the old vents. In the red, rhythmic stutter of the emergency LEDs, the lobby transformed into a combat grey zone. The marble was no longer a floor. It was a slip hazard, slick with invisible condensation. The glass was no longer a window. It was shrapnel. Above us, the heavy thumping of Blackwell helicopters intensified, the downdraft rattling the skylights until the glass groaned. I felt the familiar, cold tightening in my chest, not the frantic panic of a nurse, but the predatory focus of a PJ. The hospital was failing, its sterile heartbeat flatlining into chaos, but my internal clock was just starting to tick. I inhaled for 4, held for 4, and let the Avery the nurse persona dissolve into the dust. I was back in the noise. I grabbed the grips of Reed's wheelchair, my knuckles brushing against the cold steel as I pivoted him toward the corridor leading back to Trauma Bay 1. Dr. Maximus Vanderbilt stood paralyzed near the security desk, his breath coming in ragged. high-pitched gasps, signaling a total cognitive collapse. The whiteout of a man who had never seen a world he couldn't control. He was a liability. A bright white target in a world rapidly turning dark and lethal. I scanned the hallway, my analytic overlay identifying the breach pattern with clinical detachment. The security gates at the south entrance hadn't slammed shut. They were hanging open, their magnetic locks disengaged by a remote override. Marcus Quinlan was nowhere to be seen. He hadn't run for safety. He had cleared the path. The realization was a sharp, cold fact. The administrator hadn't just flagged Reed's X-ray as a high-value artifact for Blackwell. He'd sold them the floor plans and the codes. This was a surgical extraction, and the legal hold on Reed's life was being challenged by men who viewed patients as line items. The breach happened with a sound like a physical blow. The south glass doors shattered inward, the crystalline fragments dancing in the red light like blood-stained diamonds. Through the roiling haze of smoke and pulverized masonry, the first Blackwell operator appeared, a silhouette of matte black armor and tactical gear absorbing the light. A red laser began to scan through the drywall dust, a mechanical eye searching for the target with terrifying speed. I saw the way the laser lingered on the medical tube taped to Reed's side, the sonde. They weren't looking for the man. They were looking for the encryption key buried in his viscera. Vanderbilt let out a strangled whimper and bolted toward the service stairs, his cowardice providing the only tactical distraction I needed. I stayed low, my center of gravity shifting as I pulled Reed into the shadow of a reinforced concrete pillar. My PJ instincts mapped the distance to the trauma bay with the precision of a GPS. We had 30 meters of open ground, 2 heavy doors, and a tactical window closing in milliseconds. I saw a dropped Blackwell radio skidding across the marble, snatched it up, my fingers finding the controls with a muscle memory older than my nursing degree. The tablet display on the operator's wrist mount flickered, showing a target fixation map centered on Reed's coordinates. Beside the radio lay a discarded smart gun, a sleek P320 with a biometric grip. I picked it up, but the LED on the back blinked a mocking, stubborn red. No authorization. It was a paperweight with a trigger. I didn't waste time trying to bypass the encryption. I simply let it clatter back to the floor with a hollow ring. I don't need lead, I whispered into the dark, my voice a raspy promise tasting of ozone. I have chemistry and physics. The heavy thud of a combat boot hit the marble just around the corner, a sound resonant with the weight of armor. They were here. I looked at Reed, whose eyes were wide and focused, despite the shock, and I began the 4444 count. The silence was over. Trauma Bay 1 was a red-lit tomb of cold steel and sharp edges. I had pulled the sliding doors shut, jamming the track with a bent hemostat to create a temporary legal hold against the hallway. The smell of ozone from the failing backup generators mixed with the sharp scent of industrial bleach, creating a volatile atmosphere, biting at the back of my throat. I didn't see the room as a sanctuary anymore. It was a 3-dimensional geometry of lethal angles and ballistic cover. I analyzed the enemy's formation through the frosted glass, calculating the arc of their visibility based on the height of their tactical lights. Behind me, Reed was propped against a supply cabinet, his hand hovering near the bandages I'd applied, his breathing shallow but controlled. Vanderbilt sat on the floor, his head between his knees, a spent shell of a man whose world had ended the moment the power went out. I ignored him. I moved to the wall of oxygen tanks, my hands finding the heavy iron cylinders. The silence in the bay was clinical, a white noise contrast to the heavy footsteps approaching. The first Blackwell operator didn't kick the door. He used a concentrated breach charge that turned my jammed hemostat into a high-velocity projectile. As the smoke billowed in, thick and tasting of cordite, he stepped through the gap, his matte black visor reflecting the flickering red emergency LEDs like a predator. He was dripping from the rain, his tactical gear slick and highly conductive. I was waiting, coiled behind the stainless steel mass of the crash cart. As he cleared the threshold, I lunged forward, the defibrillator paddles in my hands already whining as they charged to 360 joules. I didn't aim for his reinforced chest armor. I slammed the paddles against the exposed écrode, wet fabric of his neck, and his soaked thigh. There was a sudden, sickening pop, the sound of a lightning strike as the blue flash illuminated every corner of the room in a strobe light of agony. The operator didn't even have time to scream. His central nervous system simply seized in a violent cramp as he hit the floor. The smell of singed fabric and ionized air filled the bay, a sensory zap signaling the end of his professional life. "Stay down," he said, though the man was already a heap of useless muscle and twitching nerves. I didn't look back as the second operator began to suppress the bay with a silenced submachine gun, the rounds thwipping into the plastic partitions and shredding the privacy curtains into white confetti. I dove for the oxygen tanks, staying below the line of fire as the glass cabinets shattered above me. I grabbed a heavy iron wrench from the maintenance kit I'd stashed under the bed and swung it with a PJ's focused, unyielding rage. The high-frequency hiss of the O2 tank valve snapping was a beautiful, terrifying sound, like the scream of a jet engine. I kicked the cylinder over, aiming the brass nozzle like a kinetic missile toward the shattered doorway. The tank didn't just slide. It shrieked across the floor. With 1,500 pounds per square inch of pressure venting out of a half-inch hole, the iron cylinder became a 300-pound projectile. It tore through the drywall, impacted the second operator in the hallway with a wet thud, and collapsed a section of the masonry wall with a bone-deep vibration rattling the monitors. The silence returned, but it was a jagged, predatory thing tasting of copper. The smell of bleach, gunpowder, and singed meat hung heavy in the red light. A new, brutal perfume for Trauma Bay 1. I stood in the wreckage of the ward, my tactical breathing 4 in, 4 out, the only steady, human rhythm left in the room. Vanderbilt finally looked up, staring at the nurse who had just weaponized his hospital with the cold efficiency of a career killer. I didn't give him an explanation. He wouldn't have understood the math of survival anyway. I moved to read, checking the seal on his femoral bandages with clinical precision. The dark stain hadn't soaked through the crimp site yet. He was still with us, his eyes tracking my move with a newfound respect. A voice suddenly crackled from the Blackwell tablet I'd propped on the workstation. A digital audit of our location. They were calling for Angel, scanning the frequencies for the ghost they hadn't accounted for. The first floor was clear, but the building was still a cage, and the helicopters were still thumping on the roof like an angry heart. The sub-level supply closet was a concrete tomb, a forgotten pocket of the hospital smelling of damp dust, stale sweat, and the acrid char of a nearby electrical short-circuit. I sat on the cold floor, back pressed against a pallet of saline bags, shielded by an oppressive silence vibrating with the ghost echoes of the siege. In the absolute darkness, the cold blue glow of the captured Blackwell tablet was a sharp, clinical lighthouse, illuminating my grey eyes and casting long, skeletal shadows Beside me, Commander Cassian Reed, slumped against a rust-streaked cabinet. His face, a map of ivory-white pain. The contrast in our physical states was a visceral audio track. My own tactical breathing. A rhythmic 4-4-4-4-4 cadence that barely stirred the stagnant air, played against his ragged mid-gasps. Every time he inhaled, I could feel the microscopic tremor in the concrete floor, the sound of a man's internal pressure fighting a losing battle against hypovolemic shock. The distant thuds of the breach teams echoed through the walls like a slow heartbeat, a constant reminder that while I worked in the shadows, the institution above was being dismantled piece by piece. I began the digital triage, with the cold, unhurried grace of a PJ performing a field repair. My fingers moved over the tablet's haptic surface, navigating through layers of encrypted noise that would have paralyzed a civilian tech. I wasn't just searching for a way out. I was performing a deep tissue post-mortem on the very system that had just escorted me to the door in handcuffs. I bypassed the secondary biometric locks using a hardware-level override loop I'd picked up in Qatar, the screen flickering with aggressive prompts before vomiting a stream of unedited audit logs. I analysed the trail of Marcus Quinlan's administrative logins, tracking his digital fingerprints with predatory focus. The data revealed a terrifying target fixation. He hadn't just accidentally flagged Reed's X-ray. He had spent the last 3 weeks systematically isolating every medical record, every trauma report, and every supply requisition related to the commander. He had Exhibit A, OBI, and C all mapped out on a digital kill sheet. His focus was so narrowed on the encryption key buried in Reed's gut that he had failed to account for the janitor in the room. The peak of the discovery hit me with the kinetic force of a high-velocity round. I navigated into a deep-level, hidden directory one Quinlan clearly thought was invisible and found a folder labelled Operator Legacy. It wasn't a corporate resume. It was a Blackwell operative ID file, complete with service records and a high-resolution photo. The man in the picture was unmistakable. Marcus Quinlan, 10 years younger, standing in front of a sun-bleached hangar in Mogadishu. He was wearing the same matte black tactical gear the operators upstairs were currently using to shred the hospital's infrastructure, his eyes holding the same dead, transactional stare I'd seen in 100 mercenaries across a dozen borders. He wasn't just a bureaucrat skimming from the budget. He was a former Blackwell, heavy embedded in the hierarchy like a dormant. Malignant virus. The feeling of betrayal by the institution was no longer an abstraction. It was a physical weight in my gut, cold as lead. Saint, Jude's wasn't a sanctuary for the wounded to him. It was a collateral asset, a strategic piece of urban terrain to be harvested for its high-value cargo. The entire hierarchy that had spent the night publicly humiliating me was compromised to the marrow. I tucked the tablet into the waistband of my scrubs, the cold plastic biting into my hip, a constant, abrasive reminder of the rot hidden beneath the hospital's surfaces. I looked at Reed, whose eyes were tracking my movements with a dull, morphine-heavy focus, his hand twitching toward the medical sonde taped to his side. We couldn't stay in this closet. The Blackwell audit trail I'd just breached showed an automated thermal sweep approaching this sector in less than 3 minutes. I reached out, my fingers finding the pulse point on his neck, monitoring the tactile thrum of his survival through the thin skin. He was holding the line, but the crimp site in his groin was a ticking clock I could almost hear. I began the grueling process of shifting his weight, bracing my center of gravity for the verticality of the next phase. The silence of the supply closet was suddenly shattered by the distant, bone-deep thump-thump of heavy breaching charges detonating 2 floors above. The vibratory wave travelled through the foundation, rattling the saline bags and sending a fresh, choking puff of drywall dust into the blue light of the tablet. They were narrowing the search. They were done with the hallways. I stood up and looked toward the narrow ventilation grate near the ceiling. Entering the ventilation ducts felt like being swallowed by the cold, galvanized steel throat of a mechanical beast. The space was a suffocating 24 inches of pitch darkness, a claustrophobic world smelling of 40 years of stagnant hospital dust and old machine grease. The physical transition was a nightmare of physics and raw leverage. I had to hoist a 200-pound SEAL commander into the narrow opening while maintaining a legal hold on my own center of gravity. The scrape of my cotton scrubs against the metallic ridges sounded like a rasp on a bone, an agonizingly loud friction that seemed to echo through the entire ventilation riser. Every movement was a grueling calculation of load-bearing capacity and kinetic energy. As I dragged Reed behind me, his weight was a dead anchor, threatening to tear the shrapnel-damaged muscles in my shoulders. The metallic taste of the dust coated my tongue like rust. My old injuries, reminders of a pave-hawk crash in a province I had spent a decade trying to forget, flared up with white-hot intensity. I wasn't the Valkyrie of the 24th anymore. I was a 45-year-old nurse whose body was finally demanding the bill for 20 years of service. The crawl was an inch-by-inch battle against the action reality of the hospital's architecture. The air was thin, tasting of old insulation and the ozone of distant failing motors. I kept my left hand clamped around Reed's wrist, monitoring his heart rate through constant tactile contact. His pulse was a frantic, irregular drum against my palm, a Morse code of impending cardiovascular collapse. I maintained my tactical breathing, the 4-4-4-4 rhythm, the only thing keeping the walls from closing in. The sweat stung my eyes, blurring the edges of the red-lit world whenever the emergency strobes flickered through the floor grates below. The vibration of the ducts was a resonant, hollow thrum that amplified every sound from the hospital below. The rhythmic thud of Blackwell's boots, the high-pitched screaming of the main alarm, and the wet, heavy sound of my own knees hitting the steel. I felt the friction of the galvanized metal tearing the skin on my elbows, the blood mixing with the dust to create a slick, dark paste. It was a visceral cost for every meter of terrain we gained, a slow-motion grind through a steel cage. We reached the main riser junction, where the duct groaned under our combined mass, the sound of stressed metal echoing through the shafts like a structural warning. I stopped, the heat in my muscles turning into a dull, pulsing ache, radiating from my spine. Reed's head lolled against my shoulder, his breath a hot, ragged puff of air against my neck that smelled of iron and morphine. I needed to break the psychological red line before he went into shock. "You know," I whispered, and my voice a dry scrape in the dark. "I once spent 72 hours in a drainage pipe in Kandahar just to avoid a court-martial for stealing a captain's private stash of Kona coffee. This is a significant upgrade in scenery." Reed let out a weak huff of air, a ghost of a laugh rattling his chest. "Army coffee?" he rasped, voice sounding like sandpaper on stone. "Anything, even hospital air, is an upgrade from that battery acid." The brief exchange was a professional audio reset, a grounding of high survivors who had spent their lives in the noise. It broke the tension just enough to keep the despair from setting in, a shared acknowledgement of the absurdity of our survival. I saw the grey sliver of light bleeding through the final exit grate that signalled the roof access point. I pushed through the final few meters, the physical cost of the climb, turning my vision into a series of jagged flashes of white light. As I reached the grate, the smell of machine grease and stagnant air was replaced by the sharp, electric scent of cold rain and night air. I peered through the narrow slits, my eyes adjusting to the transition from the red-lit ducts to the dark, wet reality of the roof. Outside, the world was a chaos of red emergency strobes and the heavy, black silhouettes of Blackwell helicopters hovering like predatory birds over the hospital's helipad. The night air was a shock to my system, a sensory jolt that promised a freedom I knew was a lie. Then I froze. A shadow moved across the gravel of the roof, a matte black silhouette with a suppressed rifle, the tactical light on his helmet cutting a clean, white path through the rain like a searchlight. We were at the exit, but the roof was a wide-open killing field. I looked back at Reed, then at the blood-slicked hand I was using to pry open the grate, and I felt the first cold drop of rain hit my skin. The transition from the claustrophobic, galvanized dark of the ventilation ducts to the wide-open killing field of the roof was a sensory shock tasting of iron and rain. The heavy thumping of the Blackwell helicopters overhead was no longer a distant vibration. It was a physical hammer against my eardrums, a rhythmic violence threatening to drown out the tinnitus ringing in my skull. I had one hand gripped white, knuckled on the rusted exit grate, when the night exploded into a staccato of tactical authority. It wasn't the jagged chaos of the Blackwell breach. It was the clinical, absolute precision of a federal intervention. The roofline erupted in a blinding dazzle of FBI tactical strobes, staccato bursts of white light, turning the falling rain into a wall of jagged diamonds. Flashbangs detonated with a bone-deep sound of a muffled thud, the overpressure buckling the metal vents nearby and sending a wave of drywall dust into my lungs. I dropped the medical kit, my hands going instinctively to my head as my analytic overlay identified the high-speed geometry of a federal breach pattern. They came from the shadows like predatory ghosts. Matte black silhouettes, far more professional and lethal than the mercenaries they were currently neutralizing with silent, high-velocity rounds. The takedown was a masterclass in kinetic authority and the brutal stripping of identity. Before I could even open my mouth to identify myself as the janitor who had held the line, I was slammed onto the wet, jagged gravel by two HRT operators. The sheer weight of their ceramic plates and tactical gear a crushing force against my ribs. The biting cold of the steel handcuffs on my wrists was a sharp, physical punctuation to the night's violence. The click, a sound of finality echoing through my bones. It was a legal hold that no medical credential or military history could bypass. I felt the rough, unforgiving texture of the roof gravel against my cheek, the smell of industrial grease and spent cordite filling my lungs as a flat. Monotone voice began to read me. My rights. I didn't resist. I didn't shout about the crimp or the oxygen tanks I had weaponized. This was the price of admission for coming out of the shadows. The system didn't see a hero. It saw an unregistered combatant with a stolen Blackwell tablet and blood-slicked scrubs. My internal monologue was a quiet, weary acceptance of the cost. I'd traded my hard-won cover for Reed's pulse. I watched through a haze of falling rain and tactical smoke as they medevaced Commander Cassian Reed. He was strapped into a high-stakes litter, a pale ghost surrounded by a frantic swarm of federal medics and SEALs who moved with the same desperate urgency I had felt in Trauma Bay 1. As the Black Hawk's rotors began to scream at full pitch, tilting the air with a savage downdraft, Reed turned his head with a slow, agonizing effort. His eyes found mine across the strobe-lit roof, a look of helpless, heavy recognition passing between us that bypassed the noise of the federal raid. He was a commander again, a high-value asset being reclaimed by the machinery of the state. But I was still the woman who had felt the rigid resistance of his pelvic bone under my knuckles. He couldn't clear me yet. The legal hold of the ongoing investigation was a barrier even a SEAL commander couldn't break until the paperwork matched the reality. Near the rooftop doorway, framed by the flickering emergency lights, Dr. Maximus Vanderbilt stood frozen, his tattered white coat now a tattered rag. His optics were permanently ruined. His prestigious hospital was now a federal crime scene, and the hollow ruin of his ego was visible in the way he stared at the steel cuffs on my wrists. The elevator ride down to the sub-level was a descent into a new, sterilized kind of cage. 2 federal agents stood on either side of me, their tactical lights reflecting off the blood still dried under my fingernails. The silence of the lift was a clinical vacuum, a pressurized space that felt more restrictive than the ventilation ducts I'd just crawled through. I could feel the cumulative weight of the night pressing in on my spine, the physical and legal cost of being a Valkyrie in a world that demanded a bureaucratic trail for every drop of blood spilled. My hands had finally stopped shaking, but it wasn't because the danger had passed. It was because the choices were no longer mine to make. The realization that my cover was permanently incinerated was a cold, hard fact. I wouldn't be returning to the quiet supply carts, the graveyard shifts, or the invisible life at St. Carmer. Jude's. The janitor was dead, and the federal investigation was just beginning to perform the autopsy on her remains. In the back of my mind, I could already hear the resonant, heavy sound of a jail cell door sliding shut, a sound of unyielding logic in a world that had finally run out of room for ghosts. The Arlington wind was a sharp, abrasive thing tasting of damp earth, grey granite, and the impending bite of winter. 1 month after the lights went out at St. Tunde, Jude's, the world had moved on to the next news cycle, but the silence of the cemetery was a different, more permanent kind of noise. I stood before a simple, weathered headstone, the grave of a teammate from my 24th STS days who had died in a sun-bleached valley I still couldn't name without feeling the phantom vibration of a rotor. I was currently free on bail, a legal hold that felt like an invisible tether. My life, a series of endless federal hearings and closed-door depositions. The cost was still being calculated by the lawyers, but my hands were rock steady as I leaned against the cold granite. I reflected on the silence that had finally changed. It was no longer the defensive silence of a hidden burnout, but the focused, predatory silence of a weapon being recalibrated for a new kind of war. The scent of the damp soil reminded me of the roof, of the rain, and of the blood that had finally been scrubbed away from my cuticles. I felt the weight of a heavy black envelope in my coat pocket, a tactile reminder that the siege was just the stress test. The rhythmic thump-tap of a cane on the wet gravel broke the stillness of the late afternoon. I didn't turn around. I recognized the cadence of a man who was still fighting through the aftermath of a junctional bleed. Commander Cassian Reed stopped a few feet away, the scent of leather and a hint of gun oil following him. We stood there together as high survivors, meeting in the unforgiving light of day. The melancholic atmosphere of the cemetery providing a more honest backdrop than the red-lit chaos of the hospital ever could. Reed looked older, his face etched with the lines of a recovery more psychological than surgical. He held another black envelope in his gloved hand, his sharp eyes scanning the endless horizon of white crosses before finally landing on me with a look of absolute respect. There was no applause, no medals, and no public recognition of the angel who had held his life together in the dark. The system had protected itself, as it always did, burying the details of the Blackwell breach under a thick layer of national security, NDAs. But between us, the recognition was an unfakeable thing. Reed reached out, his hand steady as he handed me the black envelope. Inside was a new, deep-dive threat assessment. A digital audit proving the siege at Sainte, Jude's, was just a subsidiary operation. A stress test conducted by a network reaching far beyond a corrupt administrator's debts. Blackwell was just the tip of the shadow. Reed rasped, his voice still holding that dry, gravelly edge. The tale goes all the way back to the district. Avery. They thought they could harvest us like collateral assets. Use a hospital as a testing ground for an extraction protocol. They mapped the doctors, the optics, and the security gates. They accounted for every variable in the building. He paused, a thin smile touching his lips, as he opened a small velvet case, revealing a gold Valkyrie pin. The elite PJ wings I had surrendered a lifetime ago, when I thought I was done with the noise. The only variable they didn't account for was the janitor. They didn't account for you. The gold reflected the cold Arlington light, its crisp texture a resonant contrast to the steel handcuffs I'd worn a month prior. I looked at the pin, then at the black envelope detailing the first mission of a new, unsanctioned task force designed to hunt the network that had turned a sanctuary into a killbox. The legal hold of my trial was already being quietly dissolved by hands that moved in the same shadows as Reed's. My hands didn't tremble, not even a microscopic twitch, as I took the gold wings and pinned them to the lapel of my civilian jacket. The sharp points bit into the fabric, a physical anchor, reclaiming my true rank and my true purpose. The Valkyrie wasn't a ghost of the past anymore. She was a reality of the present. I looked at Reed, my grey eyes reflecting the cold cemetery light with newfound clarity. The siege had been a stress test, and I had passed with a clinical efficiency. The network thought they were in control, but they hadn't seen the janitor coming for the ledger, and they weren't prepared for the Valkyrie to come for their throats. I adjusted my jacket, feeling the weight of the gold and the heavy, dangerous promise of the envelope. I wasn't just surviving the noise anymore. I was becoming the source of it. I looked Reed in the eye, my voice, a raspy promise cutting through the winter wind. When do we start? I